Take it away, Becky.
Whoa. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
Thank you, Becky. And thank you, Valkyrie, for the sound effects in there. And as you can see in the order of worship, the sermon today will be done by Merritt Welty. Mr. Welty, please take it away.
I would like to thank Gary for giving me the opportunity to share about my experiences as a chaplain. I haven't talked much about them, haven't had the opportunity to talk much about them. Done a lot of reflecting this last week about my time as a chaplain. It spanned over the course of about 16 years, 15 years, something like that, 2003 to 2018. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to give, again, I just want to thank Gary for the opportunity. A little bit of background. To become a hospital chaplain, in most cases, you need 5 units of clinical pastoral education. 5 units, 1 unit is 3 months each. I did my first unit at South Bend St. Joe Medical Center in South Bend, Indiana in the summer of 1990. Went on there to become a pastor of Emmanuel Mennonite Church in La Junta, Colorado for 10 years. And then East Holbrook Mennonite Church for 3 years. In 2003, I felt called to a different kind of ministry. And that ministry was hospital chaplain. I did 4 more units of clinical pastoral education at Swedish Medical Center in Englewood, Colorado. And learned that indeed being a chaplain was my calling. I loved going to work. I didn't always love what happened to the people that I cared for, gave support to, but I loved going to work. To become a board certified chaplain with the Association of Professional Chaplains, in addition to the 5 units of clinical pastoral education, or CPE, you needed 2,000 hours of work time, which I gathered while working at North Suburban Medical Center in Thornton, Colorado. Also, that was only part-time. I 25 hours a week, I think it was. To supplement the income, I also worked on call as a children's hospital in Denver, and then eventually to Denver Health Medical Center. In 2008, our granddaughter, Anise, was born. And we were fortunate enough to be offered a position at St. Luke's Medical Center here in Boise. As many of you know, that wasn't a good fit. It didn't really work out. And when I was offered a full-time position, 40 hours a week back at Denver Health, I jumped at the chance and we moved back to Denver. A little bit about Denver Health, because that's where most of my memories and stories come from. Denver Health is a level 1 trauma center located in downtown Denver. We were also a safety net hospital, which meant that we would treat anybody that would come to us regardless of their ability to pay. Each year, Denver Health would provide in the millions and millions of dollars worth of free care to patients who could not pay, who were not had the ability to pay. It was a special place. I was honored and privileged to work there. Denver Health, interestingly enough, whenever the president, and when I was there, it was mostly President Obama. When he came to town, we reserved one room in the emergency department in case he needed to come. Fortunately, he never had to come. And that was really great. Another example, though, of the kind of hospital Denver Health was, in one night, I visited the former governor of the state of Colorado, who was in a bike accident and had broken several ribs. The same night, I also visited a homeless person down in the emergency department. Like I said, that Denver Health is a special place. My primary units of coverage included the emergency department, the surgical intensive care unit, the pediatric intensive care unit, and the adolescent psychiatric unit. Although when I was by myself, which was about 4 hours every shift, I had responsibility for the entire hospital. As a chaplain, as a minister, there were a couple people that I patterned myself after. I tried to emulate as much as I could. One was a former pastor for me growing up in Elkhart, Indiana. His name was Claire Schum. Claire, Claire was a special man, and he loved people for who they were, not for who he wanted them to be. Claire had a special gift of being around people, and I really tried to emulate that in my ministry. And the other character, the other person, was from a TV show. And many of you probably will remember Father Mulcahy from the television show MASH. He was a priest and the chaplain on the television show MASH, and just a very non-anxious presence. I tried to, I wanted to be like him, and I think I did a pretty good job of that. One of the lines from one of the shows that that they did, every time I see it, I what a great line! What a great line! It was, God did not put us here for that pat on the back. God created us so that we could be here himself, so that he could be here himself, so that he could exist in the lives of those he created in his image. My role as a chaplain was not to convert, was not to evangelize. I did not consider myself to be a religious person. In fact, I still don't. I consider myself to be more spiritual in nature. My role was to be present, to listen, to care for those that I visited, to provide love, and to provide hope. So, and now faith and hope and love abide, and the greatest of these is love. So I saw, witnessed, and experienced examples of all three of these as a chaplain. But I have to tell you, I think if the Apostle Paul were here today, he and I would have a discussion about just which one was the greatest or the most important. Faith. Oftentimes I would listen to patients' stories about their lives and the difficulties and challenges that they had. And I would sit there and listen and just be amazed that despite all that they had been through, they could still have faith in God. They could still have hope. I listened to the stories and I even questioned, why, but their faith was strong. And sometimes I have to admit that they ministered more to me than I did to them. One of the things that impressed me in my time as a chaplain, people's faith. When I was called to come and be with the family whose loved one was dying, they wanted me to offer prayers for their loved one. One of the things I really tried to do was to get to know that patient laying there in that bed. And most of the time that patient was unresponsive. So I asked the family to share stories with me about their loved one. Tell me about their loved one. And would tell me stories that sometimes would just shake my head. And how could a person live like this? Sometimes these people lived and struggled so much with drug addiction, with alcohol addiction, living on the streets. They lived hard lives, and lives that, when I was growing up, I thought, the kind of lives these people led would certainly not get them into the gates of heaven. But their faith was so strong that they felt God's mercy and grace was sufficient. And they had no doubt that when their loved one died, who had struggled so much in life, and when their loved one died, he or she was finally at peace. I was struck by that and thinking, God is a God of mercy. God is a God of grace. And who am I to judge? I was impressed by their faith. And again, more often than not, they ministered to me rather than I did to them. Sometimes I struggled with people's perceptions of faith, their theology. I didn't always agree, but as a chaplain, that wasn't my job to correct. I struggled with people who said to me, well, this is God's will, I just have to accept it. I remember when my dad died back in 1974, people would come to me and he died of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. I was 20 years old at the time. And they told me that, you just have to accept this, it's God's will. And I struggle with that, is it God's will for me to be miserable? Is it God's will for me to be angry? Is it God's will for me to be sad? I had a hard time justifying that, and today I don't believe that it's God's will for us to be suffer. I just don't. I don't think God wants us to be unhappy. I don't think God punishes us. But sometimes, again, it wasn't my role to say, well, I don't agree with that. I think there's other ways. And if I had time with patients, sometimes we would talk about that. But when a patient came into the emergency department and died, it wasn't my role to say, hey, Let's correct your theology. My role was just to be there and hold a hand. I also struggle with the concept of everything happens for a reason. I still struggle with that. Everything happens for a reason. Did COVID happen for a reason? I know. Did my dad's unexpected death happen for a reason? Did my mom dying of cancer happen for a reason? I don't know. I struggle with that. I think rather how I'd rather look at it is, what can I learn from this, and how can I move forward and help others? Patients often question why. Why did this happen to me? They wanted answers, and I didn't have any. The two promises that I carry with me and hold on to. And one is God loves us, and there's nothing we can do about that. Nothing we can do to change that love, nothing we can do to alter that love. God loves us unconditionally. The second one is God is present with us always, even though sometimes it may not feel that way. Sometimes I compromise my own theology, my own belief to provide comfort for a patient. One example would be for fetal loss or fetal demise. Oftentimes, these families wanted their little baby that had died to be baptized. I don't necessarily agree with infant baptism, but that's something you do just to provide comfort and peace. Fortunately, it didn't happen very often. You know, the other side of faith is that there are some that didn't have faith, that didn't believe. And like I said, fortunately, it didn't happen very often for me. I can only remember once or twice being politely asked to leave a hospital's room or a patient's room, and once or twice when I was yelled at, and only once when I was threatened physically with bodily harm. Also saw examples of love, family support. When a loved one came into the hospital, unfortunately, they can't do that today because of the restrictions in most hospitals, but when a loved one came in with a critical injury or critical illness, families came and they supported each other. They loved each other. I especially was struck when I think about the Hispanic culture, the African-American culture. When a loved one came in, the family came. And at first I was a bit intimidated, but what I mean by family is not just the parents or the children, but the aunts and the uncles and the nieces and the nephews and the cousins twice removed. They came and they supported each other and they loved each other. And that impressed me. And I came to welcome that. They came and brought food. Sometimes even gave it and shared it with me. I was impressed by the way nurses have the most difficult job in the hospital. I got to tell you, they have the most difficult job in the hospital. They cared for patients even when the patients yelled at them. The nurses, I can't imagine what it takes now today for those, especially caring for COVID patients, to go into a patient's room. The love that they have for their job and for their patients will always be with me. And of course, I witnessed the opposite of love. Last week in his sermon, Gary mentioned we live in a broken world. And unfortunately, I saw examples of that every week, sometimes every day. One of my earliest memories after being full-time at Denver Health, starting there, was receiving a page to come to the emergency room. I carried 2 pagers. One was a personal pager where Anybody in the hospital could get a hold of me at any time to come and visit a patient or be with the family. The other was what we call the trauma pager. As I mentioned earlier, Denver Health is a level 1 trauma center. We had 2 levels of trauma. One was an activation, the other one was an alert. The activations were more critical. We received a trauma activation alert one night of a 5-year-old that had been shot in the head. And I thought surely this was a mistake. As I was going down to the emergency department, got another trauma activation of a 25-year-old man who had been shot in the head. And I thought, well, at least it wasn't a 5-year-old, it was just a mistake. When I got down there, I learned that the 25-year-old, after an argument with his wife, had shot his son in the head. That night, that little boy died, surrounded by doctors and nurses, respiratory therapists, and me. The next night, the father died, surrounded by his family. We had a lot of gunshot wounds, a lot of stabbings, a lot of assaults that came to us. People's and families' lives turned upside down by violence, by intolerance, by hate. I got to tell you, I'm not a fan of guns. I don't like guns. I don't have guns. I'm not anti-hunter, but if you want to impress me, hunt with a bow and arrow. I support Black Lives Matter. But I was also in the emergency department when police officers were brought in to us and had been shot. And at least 2 died on my watch and my shifts. Actually, I think I can support both Black Lives Matter and police. I don't think it has to be a dichotomy. I don't think it has to be opposite. I think it can be both. Unfortunately, the past president thought it could only be one. Hope. Perhaps my favorite movie of all time is Shawshank Redemption. And my favorite line from that movie is, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. I saw hope every day in families' lives, in the way they came and the way they remained hopeful for their loved ones' recovery. One story that I will always remember was a young man named Paul. We called him PJ. We know he was assaulted. We're not sure how, but we knew that he suffered a very severe traumatic brain injury and had little hope for his recovery, let alone a meaningful recovery. His family was not religious, not spiritual, but they accepted me and they welcomed me. The mother was there every day, and she never gave up hope that her son would recover. And while he did recover some, he didn't regain a lot of his motor skills, he did regain his personality. And he was a jokester, and he loved to joke with people. One of his favorite things when I came into the room was to shake my hand. And his hand was like a vice grip. Sometimes I had to pry his fingers off of my hand. But it was a joy because of the progress that he had made. Families, hope. They didn't give up hope. And sometimes when I did, they didn't. Then the other side of hope is things that I saw in the adolescent psychiatric unit. Denver Health had 3 psychiatric units, 2 for adults and 1 for adolescents. You know, you go into a unit like the adolescent unit and you look into the eyes of these young people and you see hopelessness. They don't want to live. They don't have hope. I remember a young man who came in and did everything he could to end his life, even putting, his head through a wall. And I didn't have answers for them. Sometimes all I could do is be present, to listen, to hold a hand, and sometimes maybe to educate. It's surprising how many of these young people blame themselves for their own depression, for their own mental illness. They thought they could flip a switch and everything would be okay, but they couldn't do that, and then it didn't work, and they still were depressed. I still remember one young man who broke into tears as we talked, and he realized his depression, his mental illness was not his fault. There are many experiences that I will never forget. Images of broken and shattered bodies and lives are etched in my memory. Young men and young women struggling with mental illness, with depression, but also struggling with their identity and who they were, who they are. Are they gay? Are they lesbian? Are they transgender? But also have images and memories of people getting well, healed from their injuries and walking out of the hospital, of young people leaving the adolescent unit with a new lease on life. So I have the difficult memories. I also have the good memories. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. So is love the greatest? Paul is talking about spiritual gifts here. And so maybe as a spiritual gift, maybe it is. I saw many people and learned to know many people in the hospital who lived a life without a faith in God, who didn't believe in God. Some would argue you can't be happy if you don't believe in God, but I saw these people and I lived with them and learned from them, and yes, they were happy. So maybe we can live without faith. I'm not sure we can live without love. Loneliness is everything it's cracked up to be. I saw a lot of lonely people. But I know you can't live without hope. You cannot live without hope. So I think, to me, the greatest of these three and the most important of these three is hope. Hope. I have to admit that this past year has been difficult. With the past president, the pandemic. Sometimes I wonder if life is ever going to be normal again. Well, I don't even know what normal is sometimes. Sometimes I struggle with hope. But today, I have hope. I have hope that things are going to get better, because hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. And so today I hope for better treatments for mental illness. I hope for those of us who don't struggle with depression or mental illness, for better understanding and compassion for those who do. I hope for better treatments for other illnesses like cancer and heart disease, for flu, for colds, and for COVID. I hope for an end to the violence that surrounds us, violence of all kinds. I hope for an end to racial injustice, that we can see each other as God sees us. I hope that we can be more patient with each other, and even those that we disagree with, I hope. I hope that the vaccine works. Today, Lynn and I are getting our shots, our first shots. I hope. I hope that we can get together as a church soon. Because let me tell you, it's a lot easier preaching when I can look at the people and see them than looking at a screen. So I hope that we can get together as a church soon. I think we will. And I hope that God's love and healing presence will flood down upon our broken world, bringing healing and wholeness to us all. I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have, either by email, or if you want to get together and chat, or even our response today. I'd be happy to do that. Thanks again for allowing me to share. It meant a lot to me. Thank you.